A few hours ago, the skies over the Middle East changed in ways that will take weeks, months, and possibly years to fully understand, as the United States and Israel launched direct military strikes on Iranian territory in what both governments described as a defensive deterrence operation targeting military bases, defense facilities, and logistics infrastructure. This was not a proxy conflict conducted through intermediaries, not a shadow operation with plausible deniability built into its architecture, but a direct military engagement between sovereign states, and the distinction matters enormously for how international law applies, how escalation is calculated, and how the global community is obligated to respond to what comes next. Iran responded swiftly and with significant force, launching ballistic missiles and attack drones in a saturation strike pattern that reflects decades of deliberate military doctrine developed specifically because decades of sanctions forced the country to build its own domestic defense industry rather than purchasing weapons systems from international markets. From Tehran's perspective, the response was not aggression, but the lawful exercise of a sovereign state's right to defend itself against an attack that originated outside its borders. And that framing is not propaganda, but a straightforward application of the same international legal framework that Washington and Tel Aviv invoke when describing their own right to self-defense. The United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force between states in all circumstances except two, which are genuine self-defense against an actual and imminent attack and authorization by the UN Security Council. And neither government has produced evidence of a Security Council mandate, meaning the legal justification being advanced rests entirely on the concept of preemptive self-defense. The problem with the preemptive strike doctrine is that it is not universally accepted in international law, with a substantial body of legal scholarship arguing that anticipated future threats are legally insufficient to justify present military action, which means the question of whether the initial strikes were lawful under international law is genuinely contested and cannot be resolved simply by the attacking parties declaring their own actions defensive. Advanced missile defense systems were actively working throughout the Iranian response, intercepting a significant portion of the incoming projectiles, but no defense architecture in existence makes aerial conflict clean or consequence-free, and every missile that breaks through represents not a statistic but a potential civilian tragedy in a country whose population did not vote for this escalation and has no meaningful way to shelter from its consequences. In Iran, the initial strikes caused houses to shake and windows to shatter in areas adjacent to military targets, and the gap between intended military objectives and actual civilian impact is where international humanitarian law becomes most directly relevant, because that body of law does not ask which side is strategically or morally correct, but establishes binding obligations about how force must be used, regardless of the justification offered for using it. International humanitarian law is unambiguous that civilian populations must be protected regardless of the military objectives being pursued, and when schools are damaged, hospitals are affected, and civilian infrastructure is disrupted, the legal and moral framework governing armed conflict does not classify those outcomes as acceptable collateral damage, but as humanitarian failures that require accountability regardless of which flag flies over the military conducting the operation. The criticism that needs to be directed in this situation is not at the principle of self-defense, which is a recognized right under international law, but at the specific methods of force being employed and whether those methods meet the proportionality and distinction requirements that distinguish lawful military operations from violations of the laws of armed conflict. The double standard that shapes global perception of this conflict is not an abstraction, but a structural feature of how international responses to military action are consistently framed.
And the pattern in which one country's attack is categorized as aggression, while another country's functionally identical action is categorized as deterrence, erodes the credibility of the international legal system itself, regardless of which specific actors are involved in any given conflict. This erosion of credibility is dangerous, not primarily because it offends abstract principles of fairness, but because a global legal framework that is perceived as selectively enforced becomes progressively less effective as a deterrent against future military escalation, which means the damage done to international law by inconsistent application is itself a concrete security threat that compounds the direct physical damage of the strikes. If this conflict continues to escalate beyond the current exchange, the consequences extend well beyond the immediate military and civilian impact in the affected region and into global energy markets, international economic stability, and the security architecture that governs how states with nuclear capabilities interact with states pursuing nuclear programs under pressure. The people who bear the cost of that escalation first and most severely are not the governments making strategic calculations in secure facilities or the military planners executing targeting decisions, but the ordinary civilians in Iran, Israel, and every country whose economic and physical security depends on a Middle East that is not in active large-scale military conflict. The history of modern armed conflict consistently demonstrates that no major war ends on the battlefield through military victory alone, but through negotiations that eventually acknowledge the political realities that the fighting itself cannot resolve. And the question of what political resolution is achievable in the current situation should be receiving at least as much serious analytical attention as the question of military capability and strategic positioning. Diplomacy appears weak in the immediate presence of explosions and missile intercepts, but the historical record does not support the conclusion that military force alone produces durable security outcomes in complex regional conflicts with state actors with deep ideological and geopolitical grievances that predate the current exchange by decades. The most important analytical framework for understanding this conflict is not the strategic calculus of either government, but the human reality on the ground, where sleeping children in civilian neighborhoods are woken by sirens, where families without access to hardened shelters calculate risk in real time, and where citizens on both sides of this conflict are experiencing the physical and psychological consequences of decisions made by political leaders operating under pressures those citizens have no direct mechanism to influence. True security, measured not by the military capability of any single state, but by the physical safety and psychological stability of civilian populations across the entire affected region, cannot be built on a foundation of preemptive strikes and retaliatory escalation, and any analytical framework that evaluates this conflict purely in terms of strategic advantage without centering that human reality as the primary measure of success or failure is applying the wrong metric to the most important question.